Today we're talking about native and base ISOs. What the heck are they and should you care? I'm going to tell you on today's episode of
Ask David Bergman.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Here I am, as always, answering your photography questions on Adorama TV. If you've got a question, just go to askdavidbergman.com and submit that form on the site. If it's one that I think is going to help a lot of other photographers, I just might pick your question to answer here on a future show. Today I've got one sent in by Andy S., and he wants to know, what is the meaning of native ISO, and what are the drawbacks of shooting above or below it? Thanks so much, Andy, for sending that question in. I really appreciate it. So let's dig deep here and talk about ISO. Now, ISO is one piece of the exposure triangle. To tell your camera how bright or how dark your photo should be, you set the aperture, the shutter speed, and yes, the ISO. Those three settings put together are called the exposure triangle. Now, the first two parts, aperture and shutter speed, are physical things that change how much light hits your image sensor or a piece of film. Aperture controls how wide the lens opens to let light in, while shutter speed controls how long your sensor is exposed. In both cases, the more light that hits the sensor, the brighter your image gets. Now, ISO, however, is a bit different. It doesn't actually change how much light hits the sensor. ISO brightens up your image after the light has been collected. It's kind of like using the exposure slider in Lightroom or Capture One or programs like that, but it's much higher quality. The reason is because, first of all, at least part of that exposure boost happens before the analog to digital conversion takes place by the camera's processor. And secondly, the camera manufacturers write the software and they also produce the hardware, so they know what every bit and byte in the file actually does. Everyone else has to reverse engineer the raw files after the camera comes out, and most camera companies don't release that info. It's a highly guarded corporate secret. I wish they would, but unfortunately they do not. Now, ISO numbers are kind of a holdover from the film days, and I'm pretty sure they didn't change them because film photographers at the time, like me, would have had a much harder time transitioning to digital if those numbers all became something different. But just like film ASA, each time you double the number on your ISO, you're adding the equivalent of one stop of light. So 100 to 200 is one stop. 200 to 400 is now two stops. So and so on and so on and so on. Now, I am no electrical engineer, but from what I understand about how ISO actually works is that the voltage is increased to the sensor. Now that amplification, which is measured in decibels, raises the level of both the signal and the noise. The higher and the higher you go, the more digital noise you bring into your image, especially in the shadows or the darker areas of your photograph. Let's think of it this way. If you took a picture of me in a completely dark room and it was just a black frame, you can boost the ISO all you want, all day long, but the camera doesn't know how to draw me from scratch. It needs at least some light or data hitting that sensor so that you can actually see an image. It does the best it can in the darker areas to try and brighten them up. It just tries to fill in that information, but the less data that's there to begin with, it just kind of has to guess, and that causes some digital noise that you don't see in real life. Now, each newer generation of camera gets better processors, so they have less noise at higher ISOs, but it is still there. Now, Andy asked me about native ISO. My guess is that he's actually really asking about base ISO. Now, I'm going to remind you that I am not an electrical engineer if I haven't said that enough already. If you are one and want to help me clarify some of this in the comments below, knock yourself out. But I'm a photographer first, so I'm going to simplify things a bit so that you know what you need to know to make pictures. That's really what's most important to me. Now, native ISO is the range of ISOs that your camera can produce without any extra digital manipulation. If your camera has what they call extended ISOs at the very top and the very bottom of your ISO range, that may be called something like high 1 and high 2, or maybe low 1 and low 2. Those are not actually native ISOs, but you can still get to them if you need it. Because that particular adjustment happens after the analog to digital conversion, it's not quite as high quality as the analog amplification within the native ISO range. Extended ISO is a lot closer to the look you would get when you make an adjustment in Adobe Camera Raw or Capture One, for example. It's still pretty good, but you're going to have less dynamic range at those extended ISOs. I generally try to stay away from those unless I really absolutely need them. Now, base ISO is usually the lowest number in that native ISO range. Let me say it again, the lowest number in that native ISO range. That's usually what people are referring to when they talk about a camera's native ISO. Since the camera companies protect their secret sauce and how those files work, we don't know exactly what's happening in the camera processor. But most cameras have a base ISO of around 80 or 100 or even 200 in some cases. That number is the ISO value at 0 decibels of amplification. Because of that, a camera's base ISO is the ISO that gives you the least amount of noise possible from the sensor. That's really what's important here. It's usually just the lowest number available before you get to those extended low 1, low 2 ISO values. So if you're only concerned about ISO noise, then yes, knowing your camera's base ISO can be slightly helpful. Now, just to add a little wrinkle to this whole equation, some cameras now offer dual base ISOs. What that means is that there are actually two different circuits in there connected to the processor. One is a low gain circuit for when there's plenty of light and you don't need to amplify the signal very much. The other is a high gain circuit that can pump more power when you're shooting in low light and need that extra amplification. You see dual base ISOs more often in video cameras than in still cameras. You might have one base ISO of 100 and then another of 640, or maybe it's 200 and 6400, whatever. Knowing this info actually could be helpful because let's say you're in low light and you're shooting at 5000 ISO. If you have a dual base ISO camera and 6400 is one of your base ISOs, then pushing up just a third of a stop to 6400 is actually going to give you less noise than shooting at 5000. That's because at 6400, your camera switches over to that high gain circuit and will use less amplification, keeping the noise level down compared to pushing up from 5000 using only that one low gain circuit. So, having said all that, the question really is, should you care about any of this? Personally, I don't think ISO noise is too big a deal anymore in modern cameras because it just doesn't look that bad, except maybe at the very highest ISO levels. To me, it just looks like film grain, which is somewhat pleasing, and most of the time you can't even see it, especially if your picture is only going to be 3 inches wide on somebody's phone. Now, if you really want, you can fix ISO noise in post. I don't use noise reduction because I think it softens the image, but you can get rid of a lot of the noise if that's your thing. However, you cannot fix motion blur. If you lower your ISO to get some perceived better image quality, then you have to open up your aperture, or if your aperture is already as wide as it can go, then you have to slow down your shutter speed. In a perfect world, yes, I want to keep my ISO noise to a minimum, but if I need to raise my ISO in order to get a fast enough shutter speed to freeze the action, it's a no-brainer. I'm going to crank it up regardless of my camera's base ISO. So there you have it. Hope that answers your question, Andy. I really appreciate you sending it in. Remember, you can send in your own questions by going to askdavidbergman.com, fill out the form on the site, and I just might pick your question to answer on the next show. If you're not already a subscriber to the Adorama YouTube channel, go ahead and click that subscribe button down below, hit the little bell icon. That way you'll be notified as soon as new shows come out all week long from myself and the other hosts right here on Adorama TV. Thanks so much for joining me, and I hope you come back next time when I've got another question to answer right here on Ask David Bergman.